to hopefully the transcript will happen in addition. So we'll post this recording on our website. It usually takes a little bit. Our communications team is usually the group to do that, and they put it on YouTube. So it takes a while to get the transcript cleaned up and things like that. So first of all, I'd like to say welcome. Thanks for taking your time today to learn about the Conservation Innovation Grants Program. This is a webinar to help explain some of the parts of the new funding opportunity that was posted on the grants.gov website for the program we call CIG Classic. My name is Caroline Sharoni, and I'm going to go through some slides today to help you understand that program. My talk is about 30 minutes, so it should leave at least 30 minutes at the end to take questions. We'll take as many questions as we can. Often we don't get through all of them. We will be taking questions by chat box. If everyone could just make sure to mute your microphone. At the end of my talk, we will literally go through the chat box and look at as many questions as we can one by one. So if you can just hold off with all your questions, because we usually get over 100 people on these calls, and it's a little too much to manage any other way. So with that, I'm going to get started, and I'm going to take off my camera so I don't distract. Actually, let me introduce as well some of my colleagues here. Jean Brewer, do you want to give a shout out and say hello really quick?
Hi, this is Jean.
And Leah Hermans as well, I think, is on the line.
Yes, hi Caroline. This is Leah Hermans, Program Manager for On-Farm Trials, on the line as well.
Great. Thanks, Leah. So the three of us, in addition to our colleague Kip Cherry, who's not able to be here today, basically manage both National Conservation Innovation Grants programs. Okay, so with that, I'm going to get started. So let me just see here. Okay, so today I'm going to do a quick overview of the program. I'm going to talk about how to apply to the program. I'm going to go over some resources and assistance. I'm going to go over quickly the national CIG priorities. I'm not going to talk about them too much. I'll just go over the highest priorities with them. I'll talk about the historically underserved set aside, because we get a lot of questions on this. I'll talk about some pre-registration requirements, and then I'll give some budget and narrative tips. And that'll leave us about 30 minutes for questions and answers. So a quick overview here. The program, the Natural Resource Conservation Innovation Grants Classic program. The purpose of this program is to stimulate the development and adoption of innovative conservation approaches and technologies on farm, ranches, and forest lands. So this is a grant program. It is not a traditional NRCS assistance program. So if you're interested in NRCS assistance for your farm because you want to impart, you want some money to help pay for conservation practices, this is not the program to go to. We are very interested in funding very novel innovations that could eventually be scaled up and be used on more than one farm. So this is more along the lines of a classic research program, but it's more of a field research program. And we have this year up to $15 million available to spend on projects. The opportunity is open to all non-federal entities and individuals in the United States. The maximum federal award we can give out will be for $2 million. So that would be the federal part of your budget. It would not be the total budget, because this is a program that requires matching funds from the applicant. As well, we have a funding floor or a project minimum that is $250,000. So every project has to ask for at least $250,000 federal dollars. If you ask for less than that, your project will not be considered. It'll be kicked out of the competition. The reason for this is we are looking for larger projects, and there are other funding opportunities to fund basically smaller grants. Just to give you a little perspective, last year we received 51 proposals and we were able to fund 17 of those. The total amount of funding last year totaled 15 million. So we used up all of that money on those 17 proposals. The funding rate last year was quite high. As you can see, that would be an over 30% funding rate for the program. Normally we get about 70 to 80 proposals, and we've gotten as many as like 100 proposals before. So this year we have a few more priority areas, as you'll see. And so the funding rate will most likely be lower. So some essentials on how to submit an application. You can find what we call the application package with which has the description of the funding opportunity as well as other attachments on the general federal website, grants.gov. So if you just do www.grants.gov and you search out, I think if you actually just put in NRCS CIG, you can probably find this application pretty fast, but you can definitely find it if you put in the funding opportunity number, which I have here. So you might want to write that down. It's quite a long number. All applications have to be submitted through grants.gov. So you cannot submit an application by email. Therefore, there's going to be certain things that we'll go over that have to get done way ahead of time. The application deadline for this opportunity is Monday, October 30th at 11:59 p.m. That means if you submit an application at midnight, October 31st, your application would not be accepted. It cannot be a minute late. We wouldn't even be able to see that application. It would not get sent to us, in fact. So it's very important that you get all your materials together way in advance, because these systems can be complicated. And if something comes up, you're going to want time to resolve that. So this year for the National CIG Classic program, we actually have 6 priority areas, which is a little bit more. So remember, we have $15 million to spend between these 6 areas. The first area is forestry, and we're going to have a focus this year for specifically on climate smart forestry and agroforestry. So we won't accept just any forestry projects. The focus will be for climate smart. Specifically, we're looking for economic tools and guides to help producers that have forests manage and manage climate change problems. Our second priority area is habitat conservation and restoration for wildlife and invertebrates. This is a general wildlife habitat area. We will accept pretty much any application dealing with wildlife habitat, but we will show priority for applications that focus on or deal with invertebrate conservation or stackable conservation. As well, this year we have a priority area on managing agricultural lands to improve local water quality. So this isn't a general priority area for water quality. It is specifically looking for strategic ways to solve local water quality issues. So, we're looking for solutions that aren't necessarily just technological. These could be, working with community groups, overall strategies that, go from the field to the local water body and help show improvement. Our fourth priority area this year is on energy conservation. Specifically, we're looking for ideas to help producers reach energy self-sufficiency. For the first time ever, we have a priority area in economics. Specifically, we're looking at projects that compare financial and environmental data to help create synergies with conservation practices. And last, we have a new priority as well that we've never done before called Strengthening Conservation Through Indigenous Knowledge. For this priority, we're very interested in being able to learn from Indigenous knowledge and find techniques that would be able to be scaled to, modern conservation. So one of the questions we get often is if you can apply to more than one priority area, or if you can include more than one priority area. Basically, most of our proposals include multiple natural resource concerns and could possibly apply to multiple priority areas. But for each proposal for this competition, you will need to select a priority area you're actually submitting to, and that's because we have a panel of reviewers for each priority area, and it's basically you can only be paneled once. So although your proposal can include multiple priority areas, you're going to need to select at least one to submit to. Hopefully that was clear. Eligibility requirements. All individuals and entities may apply except federal employees or federal agencies. So basically, federal employees, if they're a part of your project, they cannot be a part of the project budget. That means they cannot lend any of their time or equipment to the non-federal portion of the budget, and they cannot receive any federal funds from this award. That's very important. Even though that's our one restriction, we still see proposals slip through, and often they'll get kicked out in the initial review if we do see that they are giving money to federal agencies. A very important part of this program is that there is a requirement for non-federal match. So each project is required to at least give 50% of non-federal match. We do have some exceptions to that, but they all deal with being able to qualify for the historically underserved set aside. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But most importantly, you are required to include match, and it's important that the match is committed to up front. So at the point of submitting this proposal, all the match has to have commitment. So if the match isn't coming from your organization itself, and it's coming from a partner organization or a producer, we need to see letters of commitment from those groups or individuals. Often we will see proposals submitted and the applicant will say, for instance, 50% of the match is going to come from 5 different producers, but they will include no letters from those producers. So to us, that is no match at all. There has to be a commitment. We will not be able to count that match, and sometimes that could kick a project out if they don't have other match that meets the minimum. So make sure you get those commitment letters. But I like to emphasize that each project must present an innovation. This is a program about innovation, and believe it or not, we get proposals that are not very clear about what that innovation is. As well, a critical requirement is each project must involve equip farmers. The project does not have to take place on equip farmer land, but they have to be involved in the project some way. Sometimes this is just through involvement through a survey or through a field day, but it is important that equip farmers are involved, and how they're going to be involved is described. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the historically underserved set aside. First of all, it's a technical requirement of this program that all applications involve historically underserved groups. So if your proposal doesn't have any historically underserved groups in it at all, and you don't mention that at all, most likely it'll be dinged a few points in the scoring of the projects during the review. That doesn't mean you can't apply, but it could work. It would work against your proposal for sure a little bit. We do have something different than that, though, which is a historically underserved set aside that you can apply to specifically. Basically, we commit 10% of the funds from the CIG program to award projects that apply to this historically underserved set aside. To apply to it, you have to either be a historically underserved individual, you have to be a historically underserved organization, or a historically underserved college or university, or you need to be, your project needs to benefit 100% of the producers that must be historically underserved. So that's described in the NFO. In what is a historically underserved producer is actually described on the NRCS website. So if you go to the web and you just type in NRCS, historically underserved, it'll pretty much pull up that website right away. There's 4 different groups that qualify as historically underserved. If you do qualify for the set aside, you'll go through an additional panel that has separate criteria that are laid out in the NFO. So make sure you address those criteria, and if you do address those criteria, then you qualify for this reduced match. Pre-registration requirements. So one of the things we always like to remind our applicants is to make sure you plan ahead and be sure to start your SAM registration and get your UEI number way before the deadline. Mainly this is because this can take about 3 weeks at least. So we expect to see at least 3 weeks. If there's any problems that you're having in this process, you're going to need to save those communications that you're trying to work through these problems in order to be able to submit your application. But most of the time, 3 weeks is adequate time to get this registration completed. But if you do start to have problems in that journey, please be sure to contact us way in advance. If you start to let us know about this like a day before the applications are due, there's pretty much not much we can do to help you to actually get your application in. I always like to go through a few hints on project narratives, especially because we always get a good handful of applications from organizations that don't have a lot of grant writing experience. So things that might be really obvious to a grant writer that has a lot of experience might not be so obvious. So the first thing is make sure you're very clear on what your innovation is and clearly describe why it's innovative. Don't assume that our reviewers are going to pick up on that. Don't assume that they know as much as you do. So you wanna put this really upfront in the proposal and try to make it as clear as possible so no one's guessing. Believe it or not, that happens a lot where our proposals that people that write them just assume we know what they're talking about, and often we don't. Sometimes we could glean 2 or 3 innovations from a proposal, and we're not really sure which one they're applying for. In addition, make sure your goals and objectives are very clear. And I added here, and make sure they don't change throughout the document. The word objectives can be used a lot of different ways. And what we've seen sometimes is people will submit proposals and they will actually use that term liberally in their proposal. And once we're done reading it, we'll find out as we've read it, and I don't think they intend this, but they might have 3 different sets of objectives. Objectives should be upfront. They should flow directly from the project goal. Sometimes projects have more than one goal, but really there should just be one project goal. Goals are often aspirational. The objectives are flow out of that. They're actually how that goal will get done. So make sure those objectives are clear, they're upfront, and then they're expanded on in the project narrative where activities start to flow out of those. Also be sure to clearly define what your project's potential impact is, and that should differ from your actual tangible project deliverables. Long-term project impacts often happen way after a project has ended. They're not things that are usually realized during the life of the project, but it's important to speak to them during a project so the reviewers actually know the actual potential impact, like how big it can be, what's the region, what's the acreage, how much water can be actually cleaned from this. There's a question of the actual potential, and that should be estimated or talked about in some way in the proposal. But that is very, very different than the tangible material deliverables of the project. So they both need to be spoken to in the proposal, and they should be spoken to separately. They should not be combined because it gets really confusing and we don't end up understanding really what the project will concretely deliver. To be competitive, you also need to have a very strong evaluation component to your project. If you're a small organization and you don't have, a team of people or an individual on your staff that can do that, you're going to want to make sure you partner with a group that can bring credible evaluation to the project. Make sure your team is qualified. That might seem obvious, but sometimes people will apply for a priority area, such as, a water quality priority area, and they plan to do water quality measurements, but they haven't actually hired the person that's going to do that yet. And, we want to make sure that these projects are under the guidance of people with real experience. So all your key team members should be on that proposal and be selected before you apply. If there's a huge knowledge gap on your team, we're going to really start to question your ability to follow through on those objectives and get them done. As well, make sure you have enough individuals on the team, period. Often we'll see with small groups, they'll apply and ask for $1 million, but it'll only be 1 or 2 people that make up the team. And it's very hard for these types of projects to be successful. You need a full team usually to manage millions of dollars. Be sure to address any potential downsides of your projects. Sometimes I think people don't like to talk about the downsides, but I can guarantee the panel reviewers will talk about those downsides. So if you don't address them, it becomes a major gap in your proposal. They're going to want to know how you're dealing with those downsides and if you're even thinking about them, because we're not going to want to fund something if those things haven't been thought of in advance. If your project's part of a larger initiative and you're applying to NRCS to just get part of that funding, that's perfectly okay. But one of the things that works against those kind of proposals is they don't really clearly define the lines between the bigger project and what the NRCS project will fund. So the background section should cover that and should describe that larger project, but the rest of the proposal, the methods, the team, all of that should only be the NRCS project, and it should only describe what the federal money is going to pay for and the non-federal money that is attached to that project. So be sure to be clear, because we want to know we have to know what the federal government is paying for. And if that isn't clear, that's going to work against your proposal. Also, I shouldn't really need to say this, but every year we get proposals that are very, very poorly edited. And that also works against a proposal. One time we actually got a proposal in track changes. Imagine that. We could still see the track changes. It was a mess, and it didn't panel very well, needless to say. As well, I just want to go over a few hints on the budget. We require a two-part budget. There is a budget table we require and a budget narrative, which is a written budget. And those are two separate things. You shouldn't intertwine the table with the budget narrative. They should be completely separate. The budget narrative is, your way to describe the project another way. Basically, you're describing it through the costs. Therefore, you shouldn't be integrating project narrative writing, details on technical aspects and methods in the budget narrative. The budget narrative is about costs. The cost should be described, things like annual salary of the personnel, if you're going to buy supplies, how many, where you're going to buy them from. But basically, it is another avenue for us to look at the project and understand the project. It's important, and make sure all of your line items are described. Make sure you've also used the major categories that are in the SF 424A. In our NFO, in our funding opportunity announcement, you will see a very good example of how a budget narrative should appear. You shouldn't be having your dollars, you shouldn't have any cents. It should all be rounded to the nearest dollar. Be sure to separate your cost by year. Be sure to separate the federal cost and the non-federal cost. So that's all I was going to go over today. Jean is going to help me, and we're going to go through a few questions that are in the chat box. If you do have any further questions, though, after this, you can reach us at any time through what we call the NRCS CIG inbox. It's an email address, which is nrcscig@usda.gov. And I'll leave that screen up so you can write that down, but I'm going to get out of this presentation screen and
Okay, Caroline.
Yep.
Our first question is, can in-kind contributions such as farmers' time be included as a match?
Absolutely, yes. You're going to need a way to document that, and basically you're going to need to assess, what the value of that is, and that should be done on, local values. Something like NRCS conservation practice standards actually have good guidance sometimes on that, or you could even go to your extension office to understand what a reasonable rate would be. Okay, next.
And then the next one is, can you further define the match of cash, services, materials, equipment, or third-party in-kind contributions?
In general match, we say it's cash or in-kind, right? So an organization is, either directly giving their personnel time, or it's volunteers' time. So our program allows match to be in any form. So it could be any combination of cash or in-kind. It could be all in-kind, it could be half and half, or it could be all cash. So we're very flexible because we have to meet a really high rate of match. Yes, so hopefully that answers it. Next question.
The next one is, what is an EQIP farmer?
Okay, EQIP is a NRCS program that's EQIP. I don't even know exactly what it stands for, but basically for farmers to receive funding from NRCS, they actually get the fund. They have to be registered with the Farm Service Agency. And to be an EQIP farmer, you have to meet certain requirements. I'm not going to go into those details, but the way we have this program set up is the awardee would need to confirm that their farmers are not registered as equipped farmers, but eligible to be equipped farmers. There's like a highly erodible lands requirement. It's basically that their land would qualify to be registered. And all of the farmers involved with your project don't have to be equipped farmers, just some of them do. If they receive funding from the project, they absolutely have to be equipped farmers. But if they're just, going to a field day, you'll just have to make sure some of them are equipped farmers. Okay, next question.
Can you drill deeper into the economics priority?
That priority area is very well described in the funding opportunity. I would recommend that the person who asked that question read that opportunity, and if they have further questions, to email us their specific question. Okay, next. Uh-oh, John. John, I hope I didn't lose you.
Okay,
You were on mute.
Sorry.
Okay.
The next one is, are you saying only equipped farmers can be included, or that both current equipped and historically underserved should be included?
Both. So it's a requirement of the program that you involve equipped farmers. It's within the technical criteria that you involve historically underserved farmers. So what that means is, if you don't involve equipped farmers, your proposal could actually be kicked out of the competition. You have to make a statement that you're involving equipped farmers, and you have to describe how you're involving them. If you do not involve historically underserved farmers, your proposal is still competitive. It will just be docked slightly in points because it does not include historically underserved producers. I hope that clarifies the difference.
Okay. The next one is, could I apply as an ORISE, O-R-I-S-E, ORISE postdoc because I'm not considered a federal employee?
So I don't know what that word is either. I don't know if that's an acronym for a federal office, but basically, if you get a federal paycheck, you cannot apply to this program. If you're a postdoc at a university and you're not funded from, even if you're funded from federal money, but if you're not a federal employee, you might be working with an ARS scientist, but you yourself are not a federal employee and you're at a university, then most likely you can apply.
Okay. The next one is reduced match or match waiver. Is there an option for match waivers?
There is an option for a match waiver. If you can ask for a match waiver if you qualify for the historically underserved set aside, but you have to give a justification of why you need that waiver, and you have to write that into your proposal. We had several proposals last year that assumed they could just get that waiver, and they didn't give any justification, that they were kicked out of the competition. So you have to the requirement is you have to justify that waiver. There's a lot of like 1890 universities, for instance, that, can clearly justify a waiver like that.
Okay. The next question, regarding the statement of current and pending support, to confirm, we need to provide this only for those key team members who are also working on other federal projects, current or pending, meaning if they do not work on other federal projects, we do not list them in the table. Besides the applicant's personnel, do we need to list personnel of proposed vendors and subrecipients? I can read that again if you need.
No,
me
it's going to be all your key employees. I think the purpose of the current and pending form is to ensure that you're thinking about you and your team of it's the key people, right? It's the people who are lending their credentials to the project. So if it's just a contractor, and if they were fired, you could easily hire another one. That's not important. It's someone that's bringing in expertise that actually adds value to the proposal itself. In their time, we want to ensure that they actually have time. They're not overcommitted, and it's basically a written commitment to time, basically. And it's the first year we're doing these forms at NRCS. I think it's a new form for our NRCS, but a lot of grant programs use them. And usually they can get redone. If you've got a lot of pending grants, they would get redone at the point of application. They wouldn't get reviewed during the program review, basically. That the reviewers aren't looking at that. That's an administrative form. It gets looked at when you're making the agreement.
Okay, the next question, is there a way to get a copy of your presentation slides?
Oh yeah, I can create that. Just send a note to the inbox and we will send you the slides. I guess, or if you wait a couple minutes at the end of this presentation, if you hang on, I will actually make that present. I will make that and upload it to the chat box too.
Okay, next question. What must a commitment letter include?
Okay, that's described in the funding announcement. So I'm gonna ask you to first review the funding announcement, and then you can email us if you have further questions. But in short, it basically just describes the work that's going to be done and the amount of money that's going to be committed, and it has to be signed by the organization, and it should be on organizational letterhead as well.
Okay. The next one is there a minimum number of producers required to be part of these projects?
No. But if you only involve one producer, it's not, the project's probably not going to be that competitive, but it depends on the idea. I mean, sometimes we have projects and they're testing out a really new big piece of equipment to process manure, for instance, and there's not enough money to really involve more than one producer.
Okay. Are we able to do direct grants, sub-grant, under conservation efforts and priorities, and at what threshold or dollar amount? For example, $25,000 to $28,000, and anything over, we need to consider a monitoring plan or have contracts or grant agreements like a consultant agreement?
I'm not sure I understand the question. John, did you understand that question?
Well, let's see. Are we able to do direct grants, sub-grant, under conservation efforts and priorities, and at what threshold or dollar amount?
Okay, so you can do sub awards, sub grants. I'm not sure if they're talking about actually running their own grant program with our grant money. A lot of times those kind of concepts aren't popular with our program because we want an innovation, and we've had that a couple times where a proposal will actually have a sub grant program, but most of the time those ideas don't fit well in the CIG program. But almost all of our proposals have subcontractors and sub awardees, and there is no minimum amount for a subcontract or sub awardee. Jean, do you think I answered that?
Yes, and
Okay.
I'd like to say, if you have any further questions about that, please email the CIG box, our inbox, and we can maybe have a call with you or better explain it. Okay, so the next question, on page 22, it says that we can include 3 additional pages of graphics at the end of the proposal. Do the 3 pages of graphics have to be at the end of the narrative, or can we insert throughout the project narrative and plan for an 18-page narrative as long as it is very apparent that the graphics are equal to 3 pages?
Yes, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. You can embed them into the project narrative
Okay.
and come out with 18, yes.
Next question, do the sections Declaration of Previous CIG Awards and Assessment of Environmental Impacts count towards the 15-page limit?
I don't think they do. I should have had this opened. I don't think they do, but it is very clear in the NFO. So if I look really quickly, I should be able to, let's kick that one down the road. I'll
Okay.
answer that. Let me take one while it's opening.
Okay,
I'm finding it.
next one is, can this grant be used as a part of an already started program or project?
Yes, it can. I had covered that on one of the slides, actually. It absolutely can, but what's really important is in your proposal, you need to describe that larger initiative in the background section, but the rest of the proposal, the methods, the personnel, all of those like details that you talk about, that should just be what is the NRCS project. So you're gonna have to have, it's like, it should be a sub project within your project, right? And those lines should be very distinct.
Okay. The next one is, can you apply for this grant while you are researching or working on your innovative project idea?
Yeah, yes. One of the things I didn't talk about is, the goal of this program is basically to get, it's kind of, I like to think of it as a field research program or a pilot program, because the idea is to be testing technologies that have already some evidence of being effective, but are not ready to be scaled, right? So the idea here is they need to be field tested. There's a lot of evidence that they'll work, but they're not quite ready for farmers to use the idea, right? There's not enough evidence yet for the farmers to use the idea. So it's not foundational research. This isn't something where we're funding something to be done in a laboratory. There, a lot of pre-work should already be done on the idea we fund, and it should be very close to the time when a farmer would use it, but it's not quite there yet. That's really the sweet spot of what the CIG Classic program funds.
Okay.
So hopefully that's helpful.
The next one is for the declaration of a previous CIG. Is this referring to the university overall, the lead PI, or any co-PIs? And how far back do we need to declare? For example, if someone was a co-PI on a CIG 10 years ago, would they need to disclose it on this application if they are the lead PI?
Yes, I would say if they're the lead PI and they were a co-PI 10 years ago, they should disclose that. Yes. Yes. If they are co-PI and they were a co-PI 10 years ago, I would say no, they would not need to disclose it.
Okay. Next one, where can we find previous year's award winners?
If you Google NRCS CIG, and go to, you'll go to an NRCS website, and then you need to actually click a link, and that'll take you to the actual NRCS SIG website. There is a tab at the top that does project searches. You just click on that and you'll have access to most of our final reports through that search.
Okay, and back to that question where the ORISE postdoc, they
Yes.
said that it's an educational scholarship program through a federal program.
Well, so their time is okay. So, but they're not a federal employee. So,
Yes, just an educational
yeah,
scholarship.
they're
through a
just
federal
basically getting
program.
paid from a federal grant. So their time would be, if that's like anyone who's on a federal grant, right? That, you know, their federal grant time cannot be lent to the project, for instance. So if they apply to this grant and if they get funding for their time, that's okay. But their federal grant funding cannot be added to the non-federal part of the budget. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And then someone's asking if you could clarify, it sounds like we have to have our producers identified in advance, or can we have a local partnering organization help us identify those farmers?
Yes, you can have a local organization help you identify farmers. So in terms of commitment, you know, if your farmers are giving no commitment to the project, you know, the farmers do not need to write any letters, and you definitely don't need to identify them, but the panel's going to want to understand how you're going to identify them. So, you know, if you're going to work with a partner group, you know, you'll want to just describe that process. But if your farmers are giving commitment, and let's say maybe you've got a lot of farmers and you haven't identified them yet, if this organization can speak for those farmers, such as like a cooperative or an association that they're a part of, that they're legally like they're giving money to them, so this organization can actually speak to them because they're, you know, paying members, then you would only need a letter from that organization. Otherwise, you would need letters from the farmers themselves.
Okay. And then we had a follow-up to that question about direct grants, sub-grants under conservation efforts and priorities, and what the threshold or dollar amount would be. They said that it would be subawards to tribal communities running conservation projects. So they wanted to know, like an example, 25,000 to 28,000, and anything
Yeah.
over that, we need to consider a monitoring plan or have contracts or agreements like a consultant agreement.
So I think I don't, my understanding of federal regulations is the main regulation is that whatever contract is drawn up with a subaward, you need to have flow down language. So your subcontractors and your subawardees have to adhere to the same agreement that you're adhering to, and that's what the flow down language does. And it doesn't matter the amount of the award, is my understanding. Now, I could be wrong about this. This isn't my expertise. You know, Eileen Anderson, I think if you're on the line, if you don't mind, if you could speak to this question, you might have better knowledge on this. I don't know if you're still on the line, but.
I am on the line, Carolyn. Yeah.
Great. Great.
So just for everybody's awareness, my name is Eileen Anderson. I'm a Senior Grants Management Specialist with FPAC, which services NRCS. And I just want to make sure I fully understand the question. So we're talking about subawards and contracts. And the regulations and requirements that flow through them from the prime awardee. So for example, if you're listening on the line, if you were to receive the grant and then you had a partner you wanted to make either a subaward to or a contract to, just keep in mind those are two separate things. What would you be required to put into that instrument with that other entity? And then responsible for monitoring in the course of that relationship. Yes, that's what we're. Okay, so
Okay.
for subawards, as Caroline was saying, there's the requirements in the uniform guidance, which would be the Code of Federal Regulation that governs the grants that you may receive if you're selected. Those would flow down to a subawardee pretty much in their entirety. So you'd want to make sure you include basically everything into that. For a contract, there's specific contract terms and conditions and language that would be included in that contract that you executed with that other entity. All of that information is contained in the Code of Federal Regulation 2 CFR 200. So if you want to look that up, 2 CFR 200, these references are available in the opportunity, as Caroline has mentioned. If you're wanting to know more information about them, more specific information, I suggest reviewing the opportunity itself, the full announcement that's available on grants.gov. And if you have more specific questions, please email the CIG inbox and they will work on those questions. And if they need our assistance, we're certainly here to help them with that. So
I also just put in the chat box the link to the terms and conditions. We can forward questions to Eileen that are very specific to regulations because she's really our expert. Eileen, I saw that you got on the call, so I really took advantage. Thank you so much for helping us out here today.
you're welcome.
Okay, the next question. The applicant must submit a single copy of the application. Is one single file required, or do you allow the upload of several separate files? Is there a preference for PDF files?
Yes, there is a preference for PDF files, and usually the application comes in separate parts. I believe through the wizard that's used on grants.gov, like the software that you upload different parts through those options. For instance, the budget narrative is usually its separate piece. If you include your negotiated indirect rate, that's one piece. The project narrative is its own piece. And if something isn't clear, a lot of times you can attach it to the end of another document. But yeah, there's usually several like spaces in the software where you upload. So they're very specific to specific documents.
Okay. Next one is the RFP says that innovation should not be utilized by other producers in your area. How are you defining region, county, state, etc.?
Yeah, I think that we're trying to just give you a very general description of what we're looking for. For instance, one of our projects is testing a certain type of structure in the central part of the US that's not a conservation practice yet, but it is already written as a conservation practice in the western part of the US. So that would be an example where, it's an idea that's still not commonly used, and there's a potential to for it to be used in a certain region where it's not currently used. Now, if you're trying something out that's innovative and your neighbor is also trying it, but it's still not something regionally commonly used, that's fine,
Okay. Next one, are processes with technology used as a prototype for farmers that need to be tested considered innovation?
Yeah, something that is a prototype that might, for you to say it's a prototype, I'm assuming it's not yet on the market, but it's pretty developed. And so it's in a field testing stage. That is a typical project for the CIG Classic program. Yes.
Okay.
I hope I got that right. If there were.
The next question, is the CIG a program that is available annually in case we are not ready by October 31st?
Yes, the CIG Classic program is posted annually. We are in the last month of the fiscal year here, so this year it was posted very, very late, and there's a good chance it will be posted much earlier next year. So the next year's might post as early as 6 months from now. That would be actually really early, but we expect that it will not post this late in the year. We used to always post it in April or May, and we want to try to get back to those dates. But yes, it's posted annually.
And that is it.
Okay, great. And we're 4 minutes to the hour, and in this time, I'm just going to stay on the line. If any other calls come in, that's fine. I am going to turn my presentation into a PDF and upload it in the chat box for everyone. And I'll do that right now. But thank you everyone for coming, and we're gonna put a copy of the question. We're gonna put a question and answers online, as well a copy of this on our CIG website. So, see. I keep checking. There's a bunch of thank yous, but I haven't seen another question yet.
Caroline, here's a question.
Okay.
They said, you mentioned stackable conservation. Could you define that some more?
I think the idea there is multiple conservation practices. Why? It's not letting me
Here's another question.
attach anything.
Do social mechanisms like improving equitable access to land for HU historically underserved count as an innovation?
Well, the innovations usually revolve around conservation. So, of a specific natural resource concern. So it may, but it's going to have to revolve around a specific natural resource concern to fit into the priority area. Basically, anything that fits the priority area description is allowable. So, and it's up to the panel to decide if that would fit. I would say sometimes that type of idea fits and sometimes it does not. Why I'm having trouble uploading.
Somebody wants to know, is there a resource that might help look over our applications before we submit them?
Yeah, we don't offer that. What I've recommended to different groups that have asked me that is if there's, if you have access to a university, to maybe work with them. Also agricultural extension, that's a group of people who are highly trained that are usually in your community. So they're usually very skilled, and some of them have written grants, some of them haven't, but that's someone that may lend their expertise. The one thing we ask is not to go to NRCS. If you go to NRCS, a conflict of interest then develops between the person at that field office or state office and our agency, and that could affect the review of your proposal. So,
Okay. Another question came in. When it comes to intellectual property, if a new innovation is discovered while using the CIG awarded funds, who would own the IP?
oh, intellectual property is owned by the grantee. The federal government doesn't take any IP, but we do reserve a right to use it, I think. So the language is in the NFO exactly, but yes, you would still own your own IP. I think you would just have to give us free use if we asked for it.
Okay, and here's a follow-up on the ORISE postdoc question.
Mhm.
You said my regular postdoc funding couldn't be used for the match dollars, so then I could add funds in the grant for me to work on this project outside of the scope of my postdoc hours that would be covered by the federal grant funds, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Mm-hmm.
And I do know a few of the individuals are still waiting for the slides.
Okay, so I need a little help here. I don't know why, Jean, but it's not, when I go into the chat box, I can usually upload something and it's not letting me. Do you want to look in your chat box to see if you've got the little paper clip?
Let's see.
I don't know why.
I am looking. I do not see. I wonder if you can drag and drop it.
Okay, let me try that. Be the way to go. Nope, it's not letting me. I wonder if it's because we've just have so many or so many chats in there, like maybe we've reached a. So I think I'm going to ask everyone to email our inbox. And I will email it to everyone. I've never had this problem before. Wait, what's that? No, that's just like these little. Yeah, so I think that's what we're going to have to do. I do have it. It's just not it's not letting me attach it. I wonder if there's another like section of this options. Yeah. No. Oh, okay. So my colleague said I need to close the presentation. So let me do that and see if that helps. And it's still not appearing. Oh, maybe like I'm going to get off. If you guys can all stay on, I'm going to get off and then I'll get back on. Maybe that's what I need to do. Okay. Chat. See if it's there now. Nope, it's still not giving me that option. Okay, so I think if you want a copy of this, I'll need you to send an email to either my email address or the NRCS inbox, and I will respond to you with a copy of this. I'm really sorry about that. Someone just gave me an email for the Sustainable Environmental Education Program. I'll send you a copy, and anyone else who emails me. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. We, you know, please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. And I think we're done.